For 48 years, the world believed that Soviet forces destroyed 400 German tanks at Prokhorovka in the greatest tank battle of World War II. When Soviet archives opened in 1991, historians discovered the truth. Only 5 German tanks were actually destroyed, while 359 Soviet tanks were lost. This is the story of how a desperate general's lie to Stalin became accepted historical fact. July 1943. Germany was preparing to launch its largest armored offensive since Stalingrad, but they had no idea the Soviets already knew everything. Operation Citadel assembled nearly 900,000 men and 2,700 tanks for a massive two-pronged offensive aimed at encircling Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, a 70-mile-long bulge in the front line. The attack would strike from both north and south, trapping hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers in a giant pocket. But the Germans were walking into a trap. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning at the highest levels. British intelligence shared decrypted communications. The Lucy spy ring provided advanced knowledge of German plans and timing. Soviet commanders knew the exact date of the attack, the precise location of assembly areas, and the specific units that would participate. Hitler's repeated delays only made the trap more lethal. He postponed the offensive multiple times, waiting for more Tiger tanks. Each delay gave Soviet engineers more time to transform the Kursk salient into the most elaborate defensive system ever constructed. More than 300,000 Russian civilians dug over 6,000 miles of trenches. Mine densities reached 5,000 per mile, laid out to channel German tanks into anti-tank strong points. The forward edge bristled with barbed wire ditches, steel anti-tank teeth, protected by over 500,000 anti-tank mines and 400,000 anti-personnel mines. The Germans launched Operation Citadel on July 5, 1943. On the morning of the first attack, the commanding officer of the 1st SS Panzer Division drove up to his Tigers and heard an officer shout, "We will have lunch in Kursk." But the SS had neither lunch nor dinner in Kursk. For a week, German armored spearheads pushed forward through the Soviet defensive belts. The advance was slow, costly, and brutal, but it continued pushing toward the town of Prokhorovka. With such overwhelming preparation and intelligence advantages, the Soviet victory should have been straightforward. So why did General Rotmistrov need to invent a completely false version of what happened? On July 12, 1943, as smoke cleared from the battlefield at Prokhorovka, General Rotmistrov faced a choice: tell Stalin the truth and likely face execution, or create a lie that might save his life. General Pavel Rotmistrov commanded the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, approximately 850 tanks, including 500 T-34s. His army had been held in reserve, intended as the main striking force of a future counteroffensive. His mission was clear: smash into the advancing Germans and destroy their offensive capability. The engagement began at dawn. Rotmistrov ordered his tanks forward with the command, "Stall, stall, stall! Steal, steal, steal!" The 5th Guards Tank Army charged toward German positions, firing on the move, carrying infantry on their hulls. The plan was to close rapidly with the enemy, nullifying the longer range of German tank guns. But Rotmistrov had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had launched his tanks without adequate reconnaissance across terrain he didn't fully understand. As the Soviet tanks rolled down the slopes toward the German lines, they encountered an obstacle that shattered the entire attack: their own anti-tank ditch. The Germans had seized Hill 252.2 the previous day after crossing a 15-foot-deep anti-tank ditch that Soviet engineers had dug. German pioneers had blasted a single narrow passage through for their own tanks. Now wave after wave of Soviet T-34s came charging at full speed toward that same ditch, and most tank commanders had no idea it was there. The T-34's design worked against them. The tank commander had to serve as gunner, meaning he couldn't observe the terrain while firing. Most Soviet tanks lacked radios. Only company commanders' vehicles had them, so there was no way to warn the following tanks of danger. At the last second, some drivers saw the ditch and tried to turn, swerving into following tanks. Others hurtled over the edge and smashed into the bottom. Smoke and dust hid the single narrow passage. Unable to find a crossing, T-34s milled around while German defenders opened fire. SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, son of the German foreign minister, commanded just 7 Panzer IVs that morning. He watched the Soviet attack unfold. In front of me appeared 15, then 20, then 30, then 40 tanks. Finally, there were too many to count. The T-34s were rolling toward us at speed, carrying mounted infantry. What followed was a slaughter. Ribbentrop later recalled, "Burning T-34s ran into and over one another. It was a total inferno of fire and smoke, impacting shells and explosions." His small company knocked out 14 Soviet tanks. Ribbentrop survived only when a shell fragment destroyed his gunner's sight, driving it into his eye and forcing his tank to withdraw. When the fighting ended, 359 Soviet tanks lay burning or disabled. The Rotmistrov Tank Corps alone lost 95 of its 122 T-34s, 36 of its 70 light T-70s, and 19 of its 20 assault guns, nearly 3/4 of its armor in a single day. German losses were negligible. Leibstandarte lost 17 tanks. Das Reich actually gained 8 by recovering more damaged vehicles than it lost. Instead of destroying German offensive power, Rotmistrov had thrown away an entire tank army. Stalin's telephone call came that evening. The Soviet leader was furious. Rotmistrov stood amid the wreckage of his command, knowing Stalin's reputation for dealing with failure. During the early years of the war, Stalin had ordered generals executed for less. Rotmistrov had hours to decide what he would tell Stalin. What he chose to write would shape history for 48 years. Rotmistrov sat down to write his report, staring at the evidence of 359 destroyed Soviet tanks. He picked up his pen and wrote that his forces had destroyed 400 German tanks instead. The fabrication was audacious. The TaS SS Panzer Corps had started July 12th with only 294 tanks and assault guns operational, including just 15 Tigers. Rotmistrov was claiming to have destroyed more German tanks than actually existed in the entire force facing him. His report also claimed 70 Tigers destroyed, when the Corps possessed only a handful. The lie explained a true outcome through false means. On July 13th, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The Allied landings in Sicily and the Soviet offensive in the north had changed the strategic picture. Rotmistrov's false claim provided a convenient explanation for why the Germans stopped attacking. But Stalin had doubts. A commission investigated the high losses and Rotmistrov's plans. Its findings initially recommended dismissing Rotmistrov and arraigning him before a military tribunal. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff, intervened. Soviet forces were now advancing, and the public narrative required heroes, not disgraced generals. Stalin changed his mind. Rotmistrov would not face a tribunal. The lie was told. the investigation closed. But how did a fabrication created in desperation become accepted historical truth for half a century? Stalin didn't execute Rotmistrov. Instead, the Soviet propaganda machine transformed his desperate lie into one of the war's greatest victory stories. Rotmistrov embellished the story in his post-war memoirs, claiming 700, 800 tanks had fought on each side. The death ride of the 4th Panzer Army became a standard phrase. A monument was erected outside the Prokhorovka Museum showing Soviet T-34s ramming German Tigers, an event that happened, but not as depicted. The myth was sustainable because it aligned with observable reality. Germany did lose at Kursk. German forces did withdraw and never mounted another major offensive in the east. Soviet forces did advance westward, eventually reaching Berlin. The false tactical story seemed to explain these true strategic outcomes. Rotmistrov became a hero of the Soviet Union. The lie that saved him from Stalin's execution cellars instead made him famous. While historians wrote confidently about 400 German tanks destroyed, the documents proving otherwise sat in locked Soviet archives. Western historians had no access to primary sources that could contradict the Soviet narrative. Soviet archives were completely closed to foreign researchers. German archives were complicated too. Captured by the U.S. military, they weren't returned to West Germany until 1958. German records told a different story. German unit reports showed minimal tank losses. But during the Cold War, historians dismissed these accounts as attempts to exaggerate success. Western scholars, lacking Soviet archives, generally accepted Soviet claims. After all, Germany had lost the war. The Western Allies had come to think of the Soviet government as our brave comrade in arms. Some German authors found evidence in the 1960s that tank loss numbers were wildly inflated. But without Soviet archival confirmation, their findings remained contested footnotes. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And suddenly, the archives opened. Valery Zamulin, a staff member at the Prokhorovka Battlefield State Museum, who had walked the terrain countless times, began working in 1996 with newly declassified documents from the Central Archive of Russia's Ministry of Defense. He examined after-action reports, unit reports from each day of combat, and actual orders, documents secret since 1943. The archival evidence exposed the fabrication completely. Soviet records showed the 5th Guards Tank Army lost 359 tanks on July 12th, of which 207 couldn't be repaired. Cross-referencing with German records confirmed that German losses were minimal. The entire Teka SS Panzer Corps lost approximately 50 tanks, with only a handful permanently destroyed. Zamulin discovered historians had never even agreed on the scope of the battle. The narrowest definition involved around 910 tanks, 294 German and 660 Soviet. Even expanding to neighboring units raised the total to only 1,299 vehicles, far below the 2,000 tanks described in decades of accounts. In 2002, Zamulin became the first scholar to publish previously unknown figures on Red Army armor losses. His findings, published in Russia in 2005 as Demolishing the Myth, confirmed what German authors had suspected since the 1960s. Prokhorovka was a tactical disaster for the Soviets, not a victory. Zamulin's conclusion was nuanced. Prokhorovka was indeed a tactical victory for the Germans. But the German attempt to take the Kursk salient remained a strategic failure. The Germans won the battle but lost the war. the Battle of Prokhorovka teaches us that history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by survivors desperate enough to lie and political systems powerful enough to make those lies become truth. One man, facing the immediate threat of death, chose to write a false report rather than admit failure. Stalin's regime needed victory stories. Films, books, memorials, and official histories amplified the fabrication until it became indistinguishable from fact. The 48-year acceptance of the false narrative demonstrates how archival secrecy can protect fabrications from scrutiny. If Prokhorovka, one of the most famous engagements of World War II, was fundamentally misrepresented for 48 years, what other accepted facts about the Eastern Front might be similarly false? Today, Prokhorovka remains a contested site of memory. The monument showing T-34s ramming Tigers still stands. Russian national mythology still celebrates the battle as a heroic victory. The archives may be opened, but narratives built over half a century don't change easily. General Rotmistrov survived Stalin, lived through the Cold War, and died in 1982, 9 years before the archives would expose his desperate fabrication. In the 1970s, he became an honorary citizen of Prokhorovka Station. He never had to answer for transforming military disaster into historical myth. The lie outlived him. In some ways, it still does. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.